So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and as you can see from the slide, today we're talking about managing documents with folders in Onshape. So for those that haven't used Onshape in a while, we just recently added, in fact in the last few weeks, the ability to create and organize your documents with folders. Documents, in the past have been kind of the top level, so to speak, of organization in Onshape, but now you have the ability to organize those documents within folders. I'm going to talk about that process here today, creating, managing folders, sharing folders, and all the details of working with them. A lot of the topics that we're going to discuss here today are based on frequently asked questions that we've had since we released this folders functionality. So we hope to answer a lot of those questions with today's webinar. But again, as always, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. In the questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel, feel free to type in anything, and I'll do my best to answer as we go through today's webinar. But the focus today isn't really going to be so much on CAD and CAD features, but managing documents and managing them with the new folders functionality. It's going to be a short webinar, really just going to focus on folders. So feel free to ask any question as we're going through things. All right, so the agenda is real simple. We're going to start off with a discussion about creating and sharing folders. I really want to get into the specific details just based off of questions that we get asked. So what happens when you create a subfolder? What happens when you have different share permissions between the document and the folder? You know, those kinds of details that we get asked quite often. So we're going to discuss management of folders, not just, the idea of sharing folders, but how do we manage them? The subfolders, how do we get back and forth between things in the documents page? And I want to show you a few examples of all of this. So we're going to walk through creating folders and, of course, managing them. So that's it. Real simple goals today. Again, feel free to ask any question as we go through things, and I'll do my best to answer them. And as I mentioned before, I want to start simple, of course, with the creation of folders. And it's very easy to find. Under the Create icon, as of a few weeks ago, there's a new option for folder. So under Create, you'll see that new option for folder. Now, this will, of course, create a folder. But it's important to point out it will create a folder wherever you're currently at. And that's a new concept in Onshape that I want to point out. So in the Documents page, on the left side, you're going to see My Onshape at the very top. Think of My Onshape as that top level directory, that top level folder, so to speak, where everything else is going to be underneath that in whatever hierarchy you choose. So if you think of Windows, for instance, you have a C drive, and then within your C drive you have subfolders, and everybody organizes things differently. But the point is, they all have that kind of root level directory that everything sits under. And you can think of My Onshape as that top level kind of root directory that everything is going to be under. Now, the reason I bring this up is when you start going into folders, you can create subfolders, of course, and you do that by first going into a folder and then creating a new folder, right? So I'll explain this in greater detail in a second, but just realize again, where you're at makes a big difference in where you're creating that folder if you're creating a new one. So let's jump into this. Now, the first thing I want to point out is, again, the option to create the folder, and you'll see that under the Create menu. So right here under Create, you'll see the option for folder. Now, I mentioned before, My Onshape is really that top level, that highest point in the directory of your folders, and you'll see that here on the left. So if you ever want to go back to that top level directory, so to speak, My Onshape is, you can left click it here. Now, you can see I've already got two folders, Product Line XYZ and Hardware. And if I left click one of them, you can see I'm now in that folder. A little visual cue you'll find at the top here are the breadcrumbs. Right? So you can see My Onshape, and then I'm in the directory or the folder Product Line XYZ. The reason I mention this is the question often gets asked, well, how do I create a subfolder, a folder within a folder? You can do that by first going into the folder and then choosing to create a new folder. All right, so I can create a new folder, click Create, and now I have a folder within a folder, right? And I can easily go back to my Onshape here. Right? So again, creating a new folder, if you click create, you'll find that option for folder. If you want to create a top level folder that sits right under the root, you would want to make sure to go to my Onshape first, then create your folder. If you want to create a subfolder inside of another folder you've already created, it's just a matter of going into that folder and then clicking create folder. Now, a few questions that come up. The subfolders will have the permissions of the parent, and that's especially important when we start talking about shared folders. When you share a folder with someone else, it will inherit the parent permission folder. So as I create a new folder inside of a folder, it automatically grabs the share permissions of the parent. And that becomes especially important when you start sharing with teams within your organization. You'll want to share, a top level folder, and then anything within that, even new subfolders, will automatically be shared with anyone, that's in that team. I'm going to go over that in greater detail in just a bit. That is one of the big advantages of this kind of approach. It's just important to point out the subfolders will not have independent share permissions. They will be inherited from, wherever that top level is. All right, so let's go back real quickly here. Right, so that's creating a folder. As I mentioned before, you want to be very cautious of where you're currently at, whether you're in a folder or not, when you create a new folder, and that depends on where you want that folder to fall in your hierarchy. Now, the next thing that I want to bring up is adding documents to the folder. And the question often gets asked, okay, I've created my folder. How do I add documents to it? Maybe I've already got existing documents, or how do I make sure that new documents get added into it when they're created? And there are two ways to get a document into a folder. You can either create a document while in a folder on the Documents page, or you can right-click a document and choose Move To from the Documents page. Both will work. Ideally, of course, if you're creating a new document, that it should belong in a certain folder, you would just, go into the folder and then create the document while in the folder. But if you already have the document, or if you didn't think ahead, you didn't, think I didn't want it in that folder at the time, but later you do, you can just choose to move to. So let me show you this real simple. As I mentioned before, the easiest way is to go into the folder that you want. You can see I'm now in the folder based on the breadcrumbs that we see here. And then if I create document, right, it's going to be in that folder. Right, so now I've created a new document. I go back to my Documents page. You can see inside of this mechanical folder, I have the document we've just created. So that's the first thing. And if you know that it should belong in this folder, first go into the folder, then create the document. Now, that's, of course, if you have the foresight to do that. But if you don't, you can still move it. That works fine too. Let's go back to created by me, for instance, and I can right-click any document and choose Move To. All right, choose Move To, go into the folder that I need to, and say Move Here. Right. Now, one thing I want to point out is, if in this case, as you can see, this folder is a company-owned folder, and I'm going from a documents owned by me to a company-owned folder. I need to transfer the ownership. It's important to consider when you're doing a move to that you may be moving it to a folder with certain share permissions. You're going to see those detailed here. So just realize, it's one of the advantages. It's easy for me to move a lot of documents into a share folder, and all those documents are automatically shared with anyone shared with the folder. But you got to consider that, as you're moving documents into that share folder, think about who is shared into this folder. Am I comfortable with sharing these documents with that person? Or in this case, even transferring the ownership to the company, because the company owns the folder. So there's an important thing to consider there when we talk about the share permissions. Questions. Can we display the entire folder tree? No. Not at least in a tree sense like I'm imagining. The closest thing would be these breadcrumbs across the top with the arrows between them, but you're not seeing the entire hierarchy in a single layout. So I think the short answer is no. Can we view the folder tree similar to expanding a folder tree? No, I think that's the same question, and is similar to like a Windows Explorer type format where you can expand it out. No, as you go into the folders, you're going to see the breadcrumbs across the top, right? So I'm going to see even as I drill down into those, but that's not going to give me any context to anything else within it. So I think the short answer is no. So as I mentioned before, again, right-click, choose that option to move to, then just choose what folder you want to move the document to, right? Choose Move Here, and it will move that document into that folder. So really, again, two ways to get a document into a folder. A, create it in that folder by going into the folder first, then creating a document, or right-click from the Documents page, choose the option to move to, and then choose the folder you want to move it to. Don't worry about breaking references or any of those kinds of issues. You don't have any of that in Onshape, period. So you can move anything you want to any folder that you want. The only thing I would be really considerate of is, recognize that that folder may have share permissions, and you may be sharing that document by moving it into that folder. And that's one of the biggest advantages, especially if you're in an organization, you need to share with a team. You might need to share a number of documents with a team. It's very easy to do this, right? I can even, control select a number of different things, and move them all at once. Again, just remember, the share permissions. You're sharing anything in that folder with a certain permission level, depending on how that's set up. Another question that gets asked, let's jump back to the slide real quickly here. So that's adding documents to folders. Another question that gets asked is moving folders. Can you move a folder? And the answer is yes. You can right-click and move to, just like you can right-click move to a document, you can right-click move to on a folder as well and move that folder from one place to another. You can also like shift select, control select multiple, and then move to as well. So if you're trying to move a number of different folders at once, you can. Again, don't worry about messing up references or anything along those lines, but you can move folders as well. That's another commonly asked question. And it's the same move to option that you have when you right-click a document. So, next question, sharing folders. And this is one of the biggest advantages to using a system like Onshape and the folder approach is just the ease of sharing. So there are a number of different scenarios that I could give you. The big thing I would stress is it's very easy to share a folder. You select the folder in the Documents page, you click the big share, and you can share with whomever you'd want. You can share with an individual. I think more importantly, when you start getting into companies, you're going to share with teams within the company. And a good example is hardware, where I may have these, one-off nuts and bolts that we use in our designs that aren't standard, but we share this standard library of whatever it may be in our organization. I can easily create a folder, add all my hardware documents to that folder, and share that with the entire team, literally with just a few clicks. So it's a very effective way to share a number of different documents very quickly. The key thing to stress again is when you share a folder, you're sharing all the documents in that folder and any documents in subfolders and subfolders and subfolders. So just remember, at that level, you're sharing everything within the folder at a certain permission level. I'm going to go over the details of that in just a second. Question, can you link a document to multiple folders? No, it exists in one or the other. I'm quite certain of that. I'll try that in just a moment, but I'm 90% certain it exists in one or the other. It's unlike labels in that sense. Question, assuming assemblies will be drawn from several folders, if an individual... Oh, he cut off. Forgive me. The question was cut off there. If an individual tries to open an assembly that has parts in another folder that is not shared with that individual, what happens? Assuming assemblies will be drawn from several folders. That's a good question. If an individual opens an assembly that has parts in another folder that is not shared Well, if they're in another folder, they're in another document. If they're in another document, that means you use linked documents to insert them, right? Which means you would see them, but you can't open, edit, otherwise change. So I'm fairly certain the answer to that is you're going to see them, but you can't do anything to interact with them, because they use linked documents to insert, right? And that's the case for any linked documents folders aside. That's folders is just a way of grouping things together, but I think that's going to be the case for any linked documents. Can you share labels? No, labels are specific to you. I think labels today have the function of kind of personal organization. Folders are more company level. You could, if you're just a single user, they work just fine for you too. But if you're in a company that works with folders, labels can still be your means of organizing, the way you like to see your data. That's where we see labels falling in. Folders, I think, are going to be really an excellent sharing mechanism within companies. Can you explain in more detail the difference between labels and folders? Think of labels as just tagging documents with a description of some sort, a bit of text. Folders allow you. There's no such concept of like a sub label, right? It's just I'm tagging a certain document with a certain string of text that helps me to organize them and filter them later. Folders have share permissions associated with them. They can be shared across teams with those same permissions. So they're unlike labels in that sense. Labels are specific to me. If I share a document with the label, the person I've shared with doesn't see that label. I hope that makes it clear. All right, so let's move on. Now, I mentioned sharing. It's very simple. You select the folder, you hit share. The big thing I would stress is if you're in an organization, you need to share with a folder with an entire team. Just select teams rather than individuals to share with. It makes it a very easy way to share a number of documents at once, right, without individually going through each one. Now, a few things that I want to bring up with regards to sharing. First off, I mentioned this already, but I want to stress it again. Everything in the document, everything in the folder, all documents will be shared with those permissions. So there's, everything in the subfolders, all the documents in the, that level and all levels below it will be shared with those same permissions. And that's an important caveat. Now that kind of adds, an additional question. What happens if I change the share permissions of an individual document within a folder? And it's worth pointing out, if it's less restrictive, the folder permissions will supersede or override the individual doc permissions. The example I would give is, let's say that I create a document or I create a folder and I share that folder with edit permissions with the engineering team. And then I create a document inside of that folder, and then I set the share permissions of that document to view only with the engineering team. Because it's in a folder that has edit permissions, that supersedes the view only permissions of the document. I hope that makes sense. So the key is it less restrictive? And I think if you think of the kind of natural workflow, the folder is going to override the permissions of an individual document, unless they're more restrictive. Now, I mentioned this earlier. Sharing folders with teams just makes the whole working out of a single set of data very, very easy. In the past, this took kind of a patchwork of different documents that everybody had to share with teams. Now you can just put everything in a single folder, share that one folder with the team, and they have everything they need access to. Right, whether that be all of your projects, maybe all of the standard library parts that you use, whatever it is that you share with that entire team, you can put into a folder. All right, so those are just a few of the frequently asked questions that we get with regards to sharing folders. The main one being, what happens if I set a more restrictive permission on the individual document? It's important to keep in mind the folder level permission will supersede or overwrite that individual doc permission in that case. All right, so what about search? Another commonly asked question that comes up is, how do I search? And that really hasn't changed. The big thing I would stress is in the flyout menu on the right. So when you do a search, if I do a simple search for a document, it's automatically going to search through all your folders. So just realize, if I do a text search for a document name, that none of that has changed in terms of how it will find the document. It's going to display the document in your search list just as it always has. What's unique, what's new, is the option for location. So on the screenshot on the right there, you can see I have an arrow pointed to the folder that document resides in. And it's a quick way to get to the folder from a search. So again, just do your search as you normally would. Search for your document name or whatever properties that you want. But realize in that flyout on the right, if a document is in a folder, you're going to see location and a link. And you can click that, and it will take you to that folder. So it's just a quick way. I think, a lot of users are familiar with, like a right-click option that says open file or open folder containing, where it takes you to that folder. And that's a very similar type of behavior. But just realize that search hasn't really changed. If you do a search, it's going to search for all documents, even within folders. And you can now left-click the location, and it will take you to that folder directly without having to go into my Onshape and then actually go through the folders. So search definitely has its role, especially as you start getting into multiple subfolders and things like that. Going through them one at a time isn't necessarily practical. Search is still going to be a very heavily used thing. All right, so the next thing I want to mention, deleting folders, move to trash. So the important thing I would stress, and this is the commonly asked question that we get, is what happens when you delete a folder? And the thing to stress is, yes, it will delete all documents within the folder or subfolders within that folder, right? It goes all the way down and finds all documents and puts them in the trash. So important to stress, when you do, the right-click move to trash on a folder, it is going to take all the documents and move them into trash at once. That means that if you don't want to do that, you'd want to move them out of the folder. And I showed you how to do a move to just a moment ago. Move them out of the folders first before you delete them. Now, remember, trash isn't permanent. You can go into trash and restore if you want to, but you only have, I believe, 30 days to do that. So remember, deleting or moving to trash, if you do that on a folder, you're going to take all the documents with it. And if you want to keep them, I would move them out of the folder first and then do your delete. All right, so that is deleting folders. That's another commonly asked question that we get. So let's move on to the next one. Share documents. Now, this is one of the last real important points that I wanted to make here, and that is sharing documents, shared documents, and how they interact with folders. So I showed you earlier how you can right-click a document in the Documents page, and you can choose the option to move to. So you right-click the document, and you say Move To, and then you choose the document that you want. What you'll notice is you can't do that on documents that have been shared with you. And the reason for that is because then, remember, when you move a document into a folder, you're also inheriting all the permissions of that folder. And you can't do that with a shared document, right? The potential for conflict is pretty obvious there, but just keep in mind, if you don't see the Move To option in the right-click menu, is that document shared with you, right? Do you have the ownership of that document? So again, the reason behind it is, remember, when you move a document into a folder, it inherits all the permissions of that folder. Right? Question: does the folder name fully qualify the document? For example, can we have a folder named Subassemblies in a parent called Project 1 and another different folder also called Subassembly folder named Project 2? Yes. So you should not have any kind of naming conflicts because you have subfolder names within different folders of the same name. That's not an issue. again, it's not the limitations of Windows in that sense, or in many senses where you have the issue of IDs that are conflicting or things like that. We don't have that issue with names either. You can name the same document the same name multiple times. There's an internal ID that changes. So you should not have any issues with, if I create 2 or 3 root level folders, and within those folders I create subfolders and they have the same name, that shouldn't be an issue, right? Because they're going to have unique IDs. But again, I want to stress there's a scenario where you right-click a document, the Documents page, and you don't see the option to move to, is that document shared with you? That's something that we've run into, and we've gotten quite a few questions on, though I did want to make sure to mention that. Okay, so that is really what I wanted to point out. The last thing I wanted to do here is discuss sharing with a team. And I wanted to mention this only because I think it's one of the most useful techniques for distributing documents amongst your organization. If I have, I'm just starting out with Onshape and we have all these different documents in different places, and I need a fast way to share a lot of them with the entire engineering team, folders and the team sharing mechanism is by far the easiest way to do that. So let's discuss how to do that. It's very similar to sharing a document, of course, except the main difference, of course, is you're going to select a folder at the top of the Documents page. You can see here, then click Share. Then I can go to Teams, specify the team, and then define their permissions. Right? Remember, again, I'm defining the permissions for the entire folder, all documents within that folder. So I define the permissions, right? Editor view, I click share, and now the entire team has those permissions to that document. Now, another example would be something like hardware, where they may not necessarily need edit permissions, and it may be a scenario where it's view and link, right? Where I'm allowing them to link documents in from this. So it depends on the scenario. If it's an active project, of course, the engineering team may need edit permissions, but if it's a hardware component and you don't want, things being modified, you can certainly control that, in the permissions when you share them. The key thing to stress is, again, those permissions propagate to anything within that folder. So that is what I had planned. I know it's a short webinar. I am going to stick around and make sure to answer any questions that you have. So feel free to ask any questions in the GoToWebinar control panel. I will stick around to make sure all those get answered. The last thing I want to mention here, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out learn.onshape.com. There you'll find self-paced training. We have links to instructor-led training, even technical briefings that discuss a lot of things, including things like document organization and folder structure and all kinds of valuable tech tips and techniques. So definitely check out learn.onshape.com. Again, I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. So make sure to type them in the GoToWebinar control panel. But that's it, everyone. Thank you and have a good day.